Max Payne, a damn good game and a damn good series. I've been on a bit of a Max Payne kick recently. Why? Well, I guess I just have a rotation of favorite games I go back to every so often, and Max Payne is part of that particular rotation. With that said, there's one version of Max Payne I I never got around to playing until now because I never really had a reason to play it. And that is the Game Boy Advance port. Let's talk about handheld gaming for a second. These days, handheld games have basically reached their final evolution, almost being indistinguishable from playing games on dedicated stationary hardware, whether it be consoles or PCs. Sure, the experience isn't quite as crisp or quite as good, but it's close enough. Traditionally speaking, the trendsetters for handheld gaming have always been Nintendo. Ever since the days of the Game Boy, it's been Nintendo handheld consoles in first, and everyone else fighting for a respectable distant second. While the Atari Lynx sold upwards of 3 million units and the Sega Game Gear sold upwards of 10 million units, the Game Boy family of consoles sold over 100 million units. The next major, keyword major competitor to the Nintendo line of handheld consoles was the PlayStation Portable, which sold upwards of 80 million units, while the concurrent Nintendo DS sold over 150 million units. How demoralizing it must be to sell upwards of 80 million units and still only sell about half of what your main competitor is selling. The recurring trend is that Nintendo always dominated even if their competitors had more powerful or convenient hardware. So regardless of the competitors surrounding them, Nintendo set the standard, and that standard was handheld gaming being about 2 generations behind console gaming. Such as how the Game Boy Advance was basically a handheld Super Nintendo and the DS was basically a handheld N64. So with these very reasonable limitations in play, it was pretty much impossible to recreate any sort of equivalent experience with console games on the most widely available handheld hardware, but it was still too popular to ignore, so there were a lot of cases where you had core games being adapted to consoles like the GBA. Sometimes devs would even try to adapt existing games and would make designated games for specific consoles, like how there were multiple Crash Bandicoot games that were made specifically for the GBA that weren't ports of any existing game. This was probably the best way to do it, since it would mean there would be no pre-existing expectations of what the experience should be like, so you're not inviting any unfair comparison. But meanwhile, as far as the games that were specific ports or adaptations of major games, the limitations of the console meant that not only did you have an expectation of what the game should look like, you also have the inevitable disappointment if you're expecting anything equivalent. But it also meant that developers had to sort of get creative with how they adapt the game, how you can take something that roughly approximates the version that people are familiar with and downgrade it to the hardware. And to me, one of the strangest and most off-kilter adaptations of a game to the concurrent handheld will always be the Max Payne GBA port. If there's one thing you know about handheld gaming, it's that up until recently, the age of the average user tended to skew younger, which is why you very rarely got M-rated games on things like the DS. So adapting a very mature, very violent game to the GBA seemed like it was a very odd choice, but since this is the version of Max Payne I never played, and since I'm always looking for the odd and interesting relics of gaming's past, I wanted to take a look at this and see how it holds up as an adaptation and as a game in its own right.
One way or the other, I was gonna find out.
This particular version of the game was made by a company called Mobius Entertainment, which would then go on to become Rockstar Leeds, the people who were the lead developer, Waka Waka, on such things as GTA Chinatown Wars. So this definitely proved their mettle. Now I won't talk about the story much, since this is the exact same story as the other versions, and I'll save the discussion for a dedicated retrospective coming your way very soon. But to quickly summarize, Max Payne is a homicide detective in the NYPD whose life is going great until one day his wife and child are murdered by home invaders hopped up on a mysterious new drug called Valkyr. After which he transfers to the DEA so he can investigate said drug, which leads him down a rabbit hole of conspiracies, government cover-ups, and a secret society of rich people who have you go after a former member of their group on account of her going rogue, ending with you dropping a mast on her at the top of her own skyscraper. And as far as the plot is concerned, it's generally seamless. Generally. That is, as far as they're willing to convey it. You see, when it comes to handheld games, cartridge space is at a premium, and so compromises have to be made as far as how they convey the story. Meaning there are several pieces to the story that are, if not truncated, outright cut. For example, the entire opening of the game, where you play through a mini-level discovering that your wife and child have been killed, is conveyed strictly by the graphic novel-style cutscenes the game is famous for, and nothing else. The same goes for the nightmare sequences. In the main version, you find yourself in designated levels where you have to play through an entire nightmare dreamscape while you're hopped up on the Valkyr drug. Whereas in this case, they skip straight from you ingesting the drug however the story dictates you ingest it, straight to the end of the trip. They'll generally show all the most relevant graphic novel panels during these sequences in order to convey all the necessary story, but the connecting levels that show you the justification for why these panels exist aren't shown. Meaning the deliberate gameplay separation that's meant to pace these sequences out is entirely removed. On one hand, I enjoy the fact that I don't have to play through the nightmare sequences because those are the absolute worst part of the game, but on the other hand, it means the story jumps around a bit. Without the necessary context or the designated gaps between various panels, it ends up making the story that they're conveying be a bit jarring at times, as if you're skipping several pages at once, because they're attempting to establish far too much far too quickly. Another example would be the instance where Mona Sachs gets shot. There's supposed to be a gameplay sequence in between her getting shot and the elevator reopening and the body disappearing because you needed a natural space and time for the plausibility of her body disappearing. But without it, it's almost hilarious. Mona Sachs is shot! Wait, her body's gone? It's ridiculous.
The how and why of it was a mystery to me.
Then there are also sequences where they outright skip entire parts of the story. For example, the second part of the game starts with you waking up from a drug trip by finding yourself getting beaten up by some minor mob boss. After you beat him, there's this sequence where you do a favor for Vladimir Lem. You ransack a shipping freighter carrying an illegal arms shipment belonging to Angelo Punchinello, a mutually beneficial thing for both you and Vlad. Then, in an attempt to try and reason with Angelo, you try and set up a meeting with him at his restaurant. This leads to a level where Angelo then blows up his restaurant to try and be rid of you, following which Vlad shows up and tells you that he'll drive you to Angelo Punchinello's estate, at which point you finally confront the guy. In this game, they skip straight from the mini-boss who was beating you up all the way to Vlad escorting you to the villain's hideout. Something like an hour's worth of gameplay just gone. Whereas in this case, they skip the entire sequence and just have you go straight to Angelo. But while I enjoy ransacking the shipping freighter, I'm not the biggest fan of the exploding restaurant sequence. Even then, it's also necessary context. Doing favors for Vladimir Lem shows you the relationship that Max has with him, showing him to be the honorable criminal that he claims to be. Meanwhile, the story feels a bit incomplete without it because Vladimir, a character who is very important to the game and the series as a whole, only shows up like twice if you remove these sequences. Furthermore, the exploding restaurant sequence is supposed to show you how desperate Max is to negotiate at that point, so even while I don't necessarily like the level that transpires because of it, it is kind of necessary to the overall plot. That's the issue here. Many of the sequences that are cut can be cut without ruining things necessarily, but these sequences build the world and make the story feel more fleshed out, build up the relationships between characters, and give the plot time to breathe. Without it, characters feel slightly undercooked and the whole story feels somewhat rushed to conclude. Which makes sense given the fact that this game managed to truncate a 10 to 12 hour game into 2 hours. In fact, they were so hasty to cut the story down, they ended up cutting one of the most necessary parts. The initiating incident of the game is that Max's friend Alex is shot and Max takes the fall for it. But it was actually a corrupt cop who goes by BB. We see him kill Alex, but you know who we never see again? BB. We never see the conclusion to that plot where we confront him and kill him. That was like a major plot point in the game that was cut entirely. I'm fine with most of the examples of truncating the plot, but this was too much. So outside of that, it's a bit conflicting. On one hand, cutting down the story is obviously necessary for the limited space of the GBA cartridge, but it's hard to say whether or not it's to the game's benefit. It's kind of like a side grade at some points if you ask me. It's both a positive and a negative to equal degrees to the point where it kind of balances out as neither better nor worse than the main version from a story perspective. But that's only because the story sequences they cut kept leading to subpar levels. So the story is worse, especially because of the BB subplot being cut, but the gameplay could have potentially been made better because of not including these levels. Had they been able to create a scenario where they were able to cut the sequences and have an overall system of gameplay good enough that this port didn't necessarily feel like an objective downgrade over the main version, it could have worked, but unfortunately that's not the case. But either way, they did a good enough job at adapting what they could, how they could, given the limitations. While some of the sequences that were conveyed through the graphic novel cutscenes in the primary version are now conveyed through text boxes, they do keep a good majority of the primary graphic novel cutscenes, including the voice acting. Granted, it's bit crunched, but this is the GBA. The fact that it has voice acting at all is kind of amazing.
I took my time, cruising around the city in the snow. There was no hurry. I knew what I had to do now. I took my time.
You're repeating yourself, you know that?
Thinking about it, building up the rage.
Though I kinda wish they could have redrawn some of the graphic novel cutscenes, or at the very least show them one at a time at all times, instead of trying to show upwards of 3 at a time on the screen, because the GBA was not capable of doing justice to these comic book cutscenes with the resolution it had. You end up with certain cutscenes that are plainly hard to make out at times. To me, it comes across as a game that may be a bit too overambitious for its own good, which would definitely also apply to the gameplay itself, as this is a game that is generally trying to adapt what is at times a shot-for-shot remake of Max Payne. Like I said, they cut certain sequences, and as for the sequences they kept in, there are a lot of sequences that are truncated somewhat, combining multiple levels into one, or at the very least cutting certain environments from certain levels, which is something I'm kind of indifferent about. Once again, you kind of know exactly what you're getting into when you play a port like this, and I don't think the parts of the level that end up being cut are so vital to the experience that they need to be kept in. Cut a room here and there, and it's not that big of a deal. It's shown from an isometric perspective, and for what it is, it basically translates the action of Max Payne about as well as you could possibly have done it. The gameplay is what you would expect out of Max Payne, a run-and-gun shooter where you have the ability to use bullet time to either slow down time or do a slow-motion dive to get the jump on enemies. You travel through a sequence of linear levels as you gradually uncover the mystery of your family's murder. The gameplay is basic. It's basically just running through levels holding down the fire button until every enemy you see, and even some that you don't, all stop moving. The controls are intuitive, if a bit limited. They had to boil things down to what was absolutely necessary because you only had 6 buttons and a D-pad, meaning the jump had to share space with the interact button, which is fine, you don't need to do either all that often, so it never gets in the way of the gameplay. If anything, jumping and interacting are more annoying individually than the shared input. There's only a handful of platforming sequences in the game, and the isometric viewpoint makes the jumping hard to gauge, leading to instant death jumps aplenty. And the interact command can be a bit annoying on account of the fact that you need to be standing in a very specific spot to interact. It's not always clear where, and even when it is, lining yourself up with enough accuracy can be a bit of a chore. You're given a wide variety of weapons, and they're all relatively effective for what they are. One thing I'm surprised at is the fact that ammo isn't more restrictive because the levels in this game are small. Therefore, you don't need that much ammo. At least not as much as the main version of the game. Therefore, you have less incentive to switch things up. It would have been smarter to give you less reserve ammo scaled to the size of these levels compared to the main version counterpart. I think some of these have marginally less ammo, but not so much that it's super noticeable. Still, I don't think you use enough ammo that you end up switching things up because you need to. I don't think I ever ran out of shotgun ammo, for example, so there were a lot more instances of me switching things up because I felt like it, not because I needed to. Plus, while they were careful to slowly introduce weapons into the game as it went on in the main version, in this version, they introduced things as powerful as M4s like a half hour in. Sure, they're rare, but to introduce something that early speaks to poorly thought out balance. Not that it really matters, because of the isometric viewpoint, differences in usefulness between each weapon isn't as noticeable because of the fact that creating a nuanced weapon set requires more nuanced gameplay that can't really exist in a system of gameplay where the enemies are this small on the screen. Because of how the game is structured, and because of how the isometric viewpoint presents the gameplay, it kind of means that each weapon sorta just boils down to thing that you shoot enemies with. And the only differentiating factor is the damage output, as well as the speed of shots. Unlike the main version of the game, where they're able to properly model each bullet as it flies out of your gun, giving them more specific control over how useful each gun is, especially when they play around with the game's speed and bullet speed. Between the technology limitations and the fact that you wouldn't be able to notice this sort of thing because of the size of the screen, they make the gunplay extremely basic. But either way, almost every gun that I can think of is basically functional, with enemies dying when you shoot them as you would expect them to. This is the best thing I can say about the combat. It's unremarkable, but it works. It does the best it can. It's also one of those games that has to ease up on the difficulty because of the fact that in an isometric viewpoint like this, you don't really know where enemies are specifically. You have a broad idea of where they are because whatever direction you're going in usually leads to someone you have to kill. But you have a very narrow point of view in this game because it's not full 3D, and so you can't see more than 10 feet in front of you. So you don't know where enemies specifically are until they're basically on top of you, so to compromise, enemies tend not to be super accurate and tend to go down pretty quickly. They even tell you the direction that shots are coming from, at least I think that's what the indicator is. But the indicator is honestly so small it's hard to even notice. They make the game more arcade style in the sense that you have a limited amount of continues and you have to play through each level with only a certain amount of lives. Which isn't too difficult. I found I was able to get through most of the game relatively simply. There were bottlenecks and a few cases where you die instantly on account of the game not being clear about certain things, hence why the platforming is so annoying, but generally they compensate for the viewpoint in a number of ways. If you're looking for a quick summation of how this game plays, it's like a better, more structured version of the game Postal. That's another isometric shooter where you're given a wide variety of weapons and have to mow through a bunch of enemies in linear environments. The big difference, of course, being that Max Payne has an overall goal other than kill all the people. It even feels quasi-3D in the same way that Postal is on account of the fact that the animation is so unbelievably smooth, almost as if they designed a bunch of 3D models with animations to match and converted them to sprite-based animations. I don't know if they're drawn over 3D models, but it certainly looks like it. You definitely feel the game was straining against the GBA hardware and how it feels like it's wanting to break free and be something better than what it is. And as such, you can feel the ambition on display, but you kinda just wish they had a few extra megabytes of space or a few extra megabytes of RAM to work with. As far as the gameplay is concerned, I think the biggest thing to suffer in this game would be the explosives. Because of the isometric viewpoint, it's hard to know the arc of where grenades or grenade launcher rounds are going to go when you throw them, and the explosion radius isn't so vast that it compensates for the unpredictable nature of the explosives, meaning I found it much easier just to use your standard guns to kill whoever, because at least those were guaranteed to move in a straight line, barring obstacles in your way. Confusing perspective and unclear throwing radius just didn't do the throwables justice. But the standard guns do enough damage on their own that it's not vital to be able to accurately predict throwable weapons. That is, right up until the final boss, where if you haven't quite mastered the exact mechanics of throwable weapons, well, you're screwed. You see, they sort of adapt the ending of the main version of the game by having these 4 cables above you, and the only way to destroy these cables is to throw grenades, and they claim to give you 1 minute to destroy all of them, and yet I found that the total time was far shorter than that. So even if you know exactly what you're doing and know exactly how to do it, I found it was difficult to pull off on account of the extremely narrow time limit. This took me multiple tries, but eventually I managed to pull it off and dropped the mast on Nicole Horn's helicopter, at which point the game ended exactly how you would expect it to. Max is arrested, but content in the knowledge that he finally got revenge for the murder of his wife and child. Ultimately, this is actually a surprisingly good port for what it is. Keyword there is for what it is. While it definitely struggles significantly from its hardware limitations, I feel like said limitations kind of creates a unique experience you can't really get from any other version of the game. It has its flaws, but I actually enjoyed my time with it. I went into it understanding the fact that it was never going to be as good as the other versions, but it was a neat little gem in its own right, that did what it could and managed quite well. It's just a shame that it's kind of lost in the grand scheme of things. This was the only port of Max Payne that isn't some approximation of the main version, and because of the fact that it is inherently a lesser version because of the context surrounding its creation, it means that Max Payne on GBA is largely not worth experiencing unless you're an aficionado of Max Payne and just want to play every single version of every single game. Meanwhile, if you want to experience the actual game as it was intended, it's still widely available. You can buy it on Steam, and while it doesn't run on modern Windows, there are ways to make it easily run on modern Windows, even if you're not super tech savvy like I am. And even as far as playing it on the go, if you have a Steam Deck, you can play the standard version all you want. I would say the Android port would be the way to go in that case, but that hasn't been compatible with modern versions of Android for some time. So that's one of those cases where it's a version of the game lost to the sands of time, unless they update it. But Max Payne in its intended form is easy enough to play that you don't need to worry about it, so if you feel like experiencing a weird port of Max Payne, it's a fun little curiosity, but outside of that, you're better off just playing the regular version. Still, it's only about 2 hours long and isn't particularly hard. So even while it's not a transcendent experience, at least it doesn't take up too much of your time during the time it takes. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always updated on what I'm doing. Also, if you're on Android, hit the hype button. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.